Welcome to AP Biology. Today I want to talk to you about evidence of evolution. There are 5 lines of evidence for evolution. The first is the fossil record. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. I'm just going to read them through now. The next is convergent evolution, which produces analogous structures. The next is divergent evolution, which produces homologous structures. You'll need to know what the difference is between these two terms and between these two terms, and how they each differently give us evidence for evolution. Then we'll talk about conserved early development and especially embryonic development. And then finally, we'll talk about molecular biology. It will be actually homologous molecular biology, especially DNA. If 2 organisms have very similar DNA, you can bet they had a common ancestor who had a very similar DNA sequence. And of course, DNA makes RNA and RNA makes proteins. So similar proteins or RNA are also evidence of evolution. Okay, so first of all, fossils. Fossils in different layers of sedimentary rock show evidence of gradual change over time. So first of all, fossils only form in sedimentary rock. So sedimentary rock is formed when sediments fall and land on plants or animals or fungi or whatever. And many sediments over time build up, and the pressure eventually produces sedimentary rock from the sediments. So it's much more likely that you're going to get sediments that aren't blown away in aquatic environments, water environments. So fossils are more likely to form actually in aquatic environments. The other thing that you need to know about this is that the oldest rocks are at the bottom and the newest rocks are at the top. So the oldest rocks will have fossils that are old, and the deeper rocks and the top layers will have fossils that are younger. So you can look for differences over time. So maybe you're looking at this, and then later in the fossil record, you see this, and then later you see this. So you can look for changes in similar fossils over time, or you can look for fossils that just disappear that suggest that there's an extinction. You're not going to find fossils in igneous rock or metamorphic rock or any other type of rock, because if the sedimentary rock with the fossils in it gets squished, squished hard due to pressure or melted, the fossils will disappear along with the sedimentary rock that changes into a different type of rock. This showed up on an AP test at one point. If a meteor strikes the planet, we're going to see signs of a catastrophe. So, for example, iridium, which is found in meteors, but not so much on the Earth, or melted glass, right? If a meteor hits the Earth and you have a really, really, really hot, it comes in very, very hot once it goes through the atmosphere, it can change sand into glass. So you might look for that. So for example, if you see a layer here of iridium or melted glass or whatever, you might expect a mass extinction event. So if you see something like that, you would have something different above compared to below. So if you have a mass extinction, you might have a bunch of new niches opening up, meaning new jobs. So, for example, when we think maybe a meteor hit the Earth, which caused the dinosaurs to go extinct, when that happened, a whole bunch of dinosaur species went extinct, and now there were no competitors in the environment, and so another type of organism might take over, like, for example, the mammals. So if there's fewer competitors, there's more places, I guess, more roles for new organisms to come in and form a bunch of different new species. So we'll talk about that again in a little bit. Okay, the next piece of evidence, number 2, is convergent evolution. So that happens if you have 2 totally different groups, but they end up having the same selective pressures and end up looking the same. So even though they're not closely related, they end up looking alike. So here's the Tasmanian wolf, which is a marsupial. They have a pouch just like a kangaroo. They don't have a placenta. Here is the gray wolf, and they, like you and I, are placental mammals, which means they have a placenta, which has an umbilical cord to the baby with a belly button, right? So they are actually very, very different. And so these 2 animals ended up looking alike because they've been shaped by the same selective pressures. So apparently, if you live somewhere and you're a hunter, to be a good hunter of middle-sized organisms, you would need, I guess, a really, really great nose. You're going to have eyes in the front of your head, right? Because you're good at depth perception. For hunting, you're going to have a really good sense of smell. You're going to have these delicate little feet so that you're quiet, maybe a nice tail to give you balance. And so you end up looking the same, even though your common ancestor didn't look the same. So they looked and acted very much the same because they adapted to the same niche, which means your job or role or home. So it's not that they live in the same place. They actually live on other sides of the planet, but they live in the same type of place with the same selective pressures. So the wolf lives in the same or lived in the same place as squirrels and slugs, right? But they have had a different job. The wolf is really good at hunting middle-sized animals, like maybe, I don't know, bunnies and squirrels and foxes, maybe. I'm not sure. Deer, if they can get a little one. Um, so they ended up doing the same kinds of things. And that ended up making them look the same, because if you don't have good balance, if you're not really quiet, if you don't have a great sense of smell and wonderful eyesight and really good hearing, you're probably not going to be a very good hunter. And so you probably wouldn't live and survive and make babies. So this is the cladogram, or the phylogenetic tree of the marsupial Tasmanian wolf versus the gray wolf. And so you can see the gray wolf is actually more closely related to you and to a mouse than it is to this marsupial. They do have a common ancestor, but it was a long time ago, and their common ancestor didn't look anything like they do, and therefore their structures are convergent. In fact, the wolf looks more like, doesn't look much like you, but is more closely related to you, right? So that means they're a common ancestor. Their common ancestor didn't have, that's this where they come together here, right on the tree. Their common ancestor did not have the same types of traits that they have. So an analogous structure is a structure that has the same function or the same form, they look alike, but they were not present in the common ancestor. So they're not derived from the same embryonic tissue. So for example, actually their whole bodies, but take any part of their body, their tail, their head, whatever, that wasn't present in the common ancestor. Here's another example of convergent evolution. Here's a flying squirrel present in North America. Here's a sugar glider present in Australia. They look so much alike, but they don't actually have a common ancestor that looked anything like that. The selective pressure for both of them was the same. So they both live in trees. They need to jump from branch to branch. They probably both eat nuts. They have to be really good at climbing and jumping from branch to branch. And they ended up both kind of looking the same. And so like the like the gray wolf and the Tasmanian wolf, they actually are in the same place here. So the sugar glider is a marsupial, and the squirrel is a eutherian, a placental mammal. So actually, the squirrel and the gray wolf are more closely related to each other than the squirrel is to the flying sugar glider, right? So here's the common ancestor for these two. So again, they have analogous structures, this nice long tail, the little face, the tiny little delicate claws, even the sort of skin flaps here that help them to fall gracefully, so that they had similar selective pressures. Another example of convergent evolution is a whale, which is a mammal like you and I. They have fur, well, at least their babies usually have a little bit of fur on their faces. They feed their babies milk. They're warm-blooded, as opposed to fish who lay eggs. They are cold-blooded, right? They have scales. The bird, the penguin here, has feathers, not fur. It is warm-blooded, but it's got a beak. It lays eggs. So even though these three species are not closely related at all, in fact, their common ancestor didn't look anything like this, right? Well, maybe their common ancestor was some type of fish. But anyway, they went through lots of changes, and the ancestor of the whale didn't look anything like a fish. You'd have to go way back further in its evolution to find a common ancestor for all of them, right? So there were lots of changes along the way. So anyway, these species are exposed to the same selective pressure. The selective pressure here would be water, right? They all live in water. And so this sort of tapered, smaller front, kind of bigger middle, this nice streamlined body, smaller end, that's all selected for in water and by the water creatures that could eat them if they weren't good swimmers, right? So species exposed to the same selective pressure in different parts of the world tend to develop the same adaptations, even though they are, well, okay, everybody's related, but pretty distantly related at this point, right? A mammal and a bird, you know what a mammal looks like, that's us, right? And a bird flies in the sky usually, right? So even though a fish and a mammal, that's this one, and a bird are pretty distantly related and usually don't look alike, these three examples all do look alike because their selective pressure was water. All right, so here are mammals like the whale and the alpaca. Here are birds like the flamingo and the penguin. And then here are fish. Here's the common ancestor of all three, right? If you go back in time, here's the common ancestor. And maybe the common ancestor kind of looked like this guy. I don't know. But, right, they didn't have legs yet or anything. But there are lots of changes between the whale and this ancestor. So the structures are analogous. Here's another example of analogous structures, a butterfly's wing. Let's see, I guess this is a bat, a bird, and a dinosaur. No, I think I don't have them right. But anyway, these, maybe I do have them right. These structures are analogous because their common ancestor couldn't fly. If you look at a bird wing, there are bones in it, right? And if you look at a moth wing, there's no bones in it. This is really just a really pretty bug. They have an exoskeleton. They don't even have an endoskeleton with bones. So even though they can all fly, their common ancestor couldn't fly. So these are all analogous structures. They look alike because because of convergent evolution. They ended up having the same adaptations to do the same things, flight. So these structures are analogous. Their common ancestor did not fly. Okay, the third piece of evidence of evolution is divergent evolution, which produces homologous structures. So if you look at a whale's flipper and a cat's forearm and a bat's wing and a gorilla's arm, they have the same bones inside. They have a humerus and a radius and an ulna, and they have little wrist bones, and then they have finger bones. So even though at first glance, these structures, a flipper and a wing don't look much alike. Inside, you can see the bones, and they do look alike. So they all had a common ancestor that had one bone, followed by two bones, followed by a bunch of little wrist bones, followed by hand bones. So homologous structures can have different mature forms, but they develop from the same embryonic tissues, and they were inherited from they were inherited from a common ancestor. Not all homologous structures still work, so there's this idea of vestigial organs. So for example, in a whale, whales evolved from land animals, land mammals, and they had a pelvis and leg bones back in evolutionary history. Their ancestors had these things. And actually there are still pelvis bones, even in kneecaps sometimes in some whale species, even though they don't have legs anymore. And so those are just vestigial structures that have have no use now, but they're still present because they were present in an ancestor, and they just there haven't been enough mutations yet to to get rid of this organ. Usually over time, the vestigial organs will go away because it does take energy to make them. And so a mutation that gets rid of them would be favored if they're not useful. But anyway. Okay. Divergent evolution is when you have one species that then changes into different species. So populations of a species that is separated and exposed to different selective pressures over time tend to evolve different adaptations as they diverge. So for example, all of these animals had a common ancestor that must have had kind of a longer nose and maybe biggish ears, but they were exposed to different selective pressures over time and ended up looking different. That's divergent evolution. So divergent evolution produces homologous structures. So here is the common ancestor that produced these three different species. These species are related, but they are different species. And one of them is actually extinct at this point. So the ancestral species had something that changed over time to make the modern species. And so the ears here of the two different types of elephants would be homologous structures because they evolved from um, the same structure in a common ancestor. So divergent means they change, they diverge, and they produce homologous structures. Adaptive radiation is just an extreme example of this. It's the evolution of many diversely adapted species from a common ancestor. So maybe you have one ancestral species and it produces a whole bunch of different species over time. This is what happens often when you have one species make it to an island where there's really just not a lot of competition. Or if you have a mass extinction event, like when the dinosaurs went extinct, there were these little tiny little land creatures called mammals, and then there was no competition out there, and they evolved relatively quickly into all the different niches that once were held by the dinosaurs. So adaptive radiation is when you have a bunch of different species produced. Okay, the next line of evidence for evolution is conserved embryonic development or conserved early development. So you can see it here. If you look at the adorable little baby human and the adorable little cat, a trained person can see the difference, but you and I might not see it. So they have this like weird little head thing and these pharyngeal slits and a vertebral column. And so it's just if you have a common ancestor that had those parts, you probably still have those parts. So if you have mutations in an embryo in the setup of the body plan, a lot of times those mutations tend to kill the organism, right? If you have a mutation that gives you like no head, for example, that's kind of a bummer mutation. So a lot of times the mutations that affect embryology affect maybe the rate of development, not the presence of something. And so you do end up getting embryos that sort of say conserved. They stay the same over time, more or less, because big mutations that affect the body plan tend to just kill the organism. So mutations affecting the relative rates of growth are more likely to produce organisms that can still survive. If you look at a chimpanzee fetus head and a human head, they look so much alike, but the adults look a whole lot different. And if you look, actually, it looks like the rate of growth is actually just maybe there was a mutation in our ancestor that caused us to not develop quite as big of a face anymore, right? And to keep that bigger head compared to the face, sort of more like the babies. So we sort of look like a little bit more like chimpanzee babies than we do like chimpanzee adults. So that's a mutation affecting the relative rates of growth, and they're more likely to be conserved to not kill an organism off than something that just like completely changes the body plan. Okay, the fifth and final piece of evidence of evolution is molecular biology. And we would say that DNA, if it's homologous, right, that was that definition of stuff that homologous structures were structures that had a common ancestor. So homologous DNA is evidence that there was a DNA sequence in a common ancestor that just got changed a little bit over time. So if you look at this is cytochrome oxidase gene, something involved in cellular respiration, right? And so if you look at that particular random gene that they picked, the human and the pig have only a 13% difference. And so that suggests that we have a more recent common ancestor than, let's say, the human and the duck. So human compared to duck has a 17% difference, which suggests that we have a common ancestor that's a little bit further away. And if you look at the cytochrome oxidase gene, again, random gene, and you look at it in yeast compared to humans, we have a 66% difference, which suggests that our common ancestor was a pretty long time ago, which I think makes sense. We don't look a whole lot like yeast.